Today's special guest is Dr. Rick Strassman. In 1990, equipped with his education in psychiatry and years of study and practice in Zen Buddhism, Dr. Strassman began the first new human research with psychedelic or hallucinogenic drugs in the United States in over 20 years. These studies investigated the effects of N N-dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, an extremely short-acting and powerful psychedelic. During the project's 5 years, Dr. Strassman administered approximately 400 doses of DMT to nearly 6 healthy human volunteers. This research was documented in his book DMT The Spirit Molecule and featured in the documentary by the same name. Dr. Strassman co-authored the book Inner Paths to Outer Space. In his latest work, DMT, The Soul of Prophecy, Dr. Strassman explores the commonalities between the psychedelic state and the prophetic state we see in the Old Testament Hebrew Bible. Currently, Dr. Strassman is Clinical Associate Professor of Psychiatry at the University of New Mexico School of Medicine. So we want to welcome, how are you doing today, Dr. Strassman?
Good. Thanks, Shane, for having me on today.
Oh man, I can't think of anybody else better equipped to have on to talk about psychedelics and in particular DMT because it's such a fascinating topic. And I know a lot of my viewers are interested in exploring consciousness using psychedelics. I mean, a lot of them meditate. And so I think you're a great fit to have on here to discuss, especially your latest work, because a lot of us have a rich history in whether it's Christianity and viewing it, the Old Testament prophecies and things like that, or just the Hebrew Bible itself. We're all interested in how it's all connected. And so I guess we should probably start, if for those who have no idea what DMT is, if we could briefly discuss, what DMT is.
Sure. Well, DMT stands for dimethyltryptamine. It's a naturally occurring psychedelic drug. It's found in hundreds of plants and in every mammalian species that's been investigated so far, including humans. It's a chemical cousin of serotonin and of melatonin. It's a pretty small molecule too, not much larger than a glucose molecule. It works in the brain by activating certain subtypes of serotonin receptors, perhaps sigma receptors as well. It's made in the lungs, the pineal gland, and probably the brain, although those data haven't been published yet. It's usually either smoked or injected. In our studies, we injected it, and in other DMT studies that are occurring around the world, it's being injected. In the field, it's vaporized and inhaled. It also occurs in the Amazonian brew ayahuasca, which is a combination of a DMT-containing plant and one that allows DMT to be orally active. Normally, if you swallow DMT, it's broken down in the gut, before it attains a level in the bloodstream to get into the brain to, cause its effects. But if you combine it with substances which slow down its metabolism, it can become orally active. It's quite short acting and quite intense, as you mentioned in the introduction. When it's smoked or even injected, it starts working within a few heartbeats, and the effects peak within 3 to 5 minutes and are usually completely gone within a half hour. But in that short period of time, quite a lot happens. If you take a full dose, most people describe a feeling of being disembodied and entering into a world of light, which seems inhabited by sentient you types of beings, um, either visible or just sensed. Um, yeah, it isn't as popular, both on the street or in the scientific research community, as its related cousins like LSD or psilocybin. Um, but you know, still, it's quite an interesting compound for a couple of reasons. Number one are its unusual effects, and number two, it's the only psychedelic which is made in the human body.
That's interesting because it's like as powerful as it is, you would think that maybe it goes on a little bit beyond what people want recreationally. If you're sort of smoking at a party, you're like, I can't imagine. I think most people that do it typically are more of on a spiritual path, or it's more they're wanting something more like exploring their consciousness or something like that, rather than just a party drug. It doesn't seem like because when I was young, I heard about LSD and I heard about mushrooms and all this. Never heard of DMT at all, which is really surprising because it is so powerful and it is so natural. If I'm not mistaken, it's built with the amino acid tryptophan, and I guess you need two more. It's two steps away uh, from metabolizing into DMT. I mean, we really have everything in our body we need to turn it into DMT in this experience. Is this has it been proven that that's what happens in our sleep? Because I know that's one of the things people typically say is that it's the same thing you experience when you're sleeping, like your body produces it. Has that been proven scientifically or through research?
Uh, well, the concentrations of DMT in the body are really low. They're pretty hard to measure. So even though it makes sense that during non drug hallucinatory experiences which resemble those brought on by DMT, that DMT is involved endogenously, but that hasn't been established yet. The circadian rhythm hasn't been established yet. If it increases during the day or at night or in dreams, or the time of death, during meditation, those kinds of non-drug psychedelic states. To get back to your point earlier on, though, about how it's it's so profound in effect, you would think that only real serious use would be the norm out there. But a few months ago, I was interviewed by a reporter from Seattle who told me that DMT is appearing in vape pens now, uh, and you could just take a puff here and there. Apparently,
Oh my gosh.
in more in a more casual kind of setting. And a number of years ago, I was in Austin, doing an event with Spangle, and Simon Posford, one of the lead Spangle people, was there. Um, and it was interesting. There was as much or even more of a smell of DMT coming from the dance floor than there was of marijuana.
Oh
And I
wow.
asked him about that. I asked, Simon about that, and I said, Simon, sounds like, or it smells like there's more, DMT, you know, uh, being used out there than pot. And he said at our concerts, there's a lot of DMT being used. So people would just take a puff on the dance floor, and if they really wanted to get far out there, they would find like a quiet corner in the hall or against the wall or go outside for a full dose. But you can use it. You can use it casually, although one has to beware of taking in too much in a setting that might be dangerous.
I can imagine a vape pen might be a little bit better than just trying to use some of the more traditional ways of vaping it, because it seems to be hard to reach a dosage to have a breakthrough when you're vaping it. Even if you've got somebody there sort of walking you through it, because you don't really get it all in one dose. Like when you administer, you could administer it all at one time, and then bam, they're getting the full breakthrough. But when you're actually vaping it yourself, even with someone's help, it's hard to be, there enough to get beyond not being there anymore, which is like, it's really difficult. So I can imagine it would be maybe interesting, on lower dosages in a recreational setting because of the kaleidoscopic colors and things like that. It really is it's a trip. But to me, it was just so much more different than LSD. It just as it relates to just the power of it and the just the sense of, I don't know, other world. It just felt very otherworldly. It didn't feel like it was sort of your brain creating something where LSD typically would, for me anyway, would take things of this reality and I would, misinterpret it, or it would sort of just change things. But it's almost better on DMT to, like you did in your studies, you said you realized, covering their eyes was actually more helpful after a while, and they began sort of putting these blinders on because it's more of a distraction, this world is, where with LSD it seemed like, you kind of needed this world to, manipulate, see the textures, sort of the pareidolia type effect of seeing things within other things. But it wasn't like that. DMT just all on its own seems to, you don't need anything else, basically. You can close your eyes and it's actually a better trip with your eyes closed.
Yeah, if you take a big enough dose of DMT, there's a complete, break with this everyday reality. Um, and also, another hallmark of a full dose of DMT is the, sense of reality, which accompanies it. It's, feels as real or more real than everyday reality, which isn't quite the hallmark of, the other psychedelics like, psilocybin or LSD.
Yeah, that's real interesting. Yeah, they're talking about ayahuasca. Um, Now, ayahuasca compared to injecting it, it's not nearly as intense, right? But it's like way longer lasting, 4 or 5 hours. Is that about how it works, or?
It can be as intense. Just depends on the blood level of DMT and the brain level of DMT. You
Wow.
know, um, the most striking difference is, the time course, like you mentioned. Instead of coming on instantly, more or less, if you smoke or inject it, with ayahuasca, it might take half hour or an hour, and the peak effects might take place in 2 hours rather than 2 minutes, and the duration might be between 4 and 6 hours compared to like 30 to 40 minutes. But the intensity, I think, can be pretty comparable.
I hear a lot of people actually get sick to their stomach when they drink the tea. Is that pretty much a natural reaction to it, or does it depend on like what you ate that day, or stuff like that?
It's pretty common. One of the names of ayahuasca in Latin America is the purge,
Right.
because you throw up and you have diarrhea. And that's probably, more because of, the other compounds in the brew rather than just the DMT itself. If you just give pure DMT, people usually, don't feel nauseous or experience diarrhea. The beta carbolines are the monoamine oxidase inhibitors, which allow the DMT to be orally active. And, the beta carbolines in the accompanying plant seem to be most responsible, for the gastrointestinal upset.
So even if you probably took that by itself, is there any effect? Like, say you were just to drink, maybe not the part of the tea that has the DMT, but just the inhibitor or whatever it is that allows you to take it orally. Does that extend the length of smoking it or vaping it, or is it completely separate?
Um, it's kind of controversial whether or not the beta carbolines have their own psychoactivity. Some people claim they do, not so much. There haven't really been any good studies of just giving beta carbolines, by, you know, 60 years or so. And, those early studies were kind of crude. But if you speak, to the natives in Latin America who live in the jungle, they'll tell you the beta carbolines in the Banisteria vine, which is also called the ayahuasca vine. Um, and it allows them to uncover the properties of other. So they'll tell you that, they discovered the combination, the DMT containing bush through the consumption of the vine first, and then walking around the jungle, and they noticed under the influence of the beta carbolines in the ayahuasca vine, that, oh, that looks like an interesting plant to combine with what we're already on. So that's the way they'll describe how they came upon the combination of the two plants. um, some people combine other tryptamines with the beta carbolines. uh, Syrian rue is another plant which grows more readily in North America, and it also contains the same kinds of beta carbolines that the ayahuasca vine does. So some people will combine the beta carbolines with um, with either DMT smoked, which then will extend and amplify the effect of smoked DMT, or it could be what's called pharmahuasca, or a you know more of a pharmacological kind of ayahuasca, where the DMT becomes orally active. Some people combine the beta carbolines with psilocybin to slow the metabolism down of psilocybin, and it's longer duration and more intense. These are dangerous combinations. You wouldn't necessarily want to cavalierly enter into them. But these are the reports that you hear taking place in the field.
Yeah, that's interesting because when I contacted you after your research had concluded, and I was interested if you were going to have any future ones. I'm sure. Let me ask you, how many emails have you gotten where people are like, "Hey, I mean, I bet you're not short on volunteers at this point, right?"
Well, I've probably gotten 15,000 emails since the first DMT came out. So, yeah, lots of them want to volunteer.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
figured.
but it's been a long time since I was doing any hands-on research. I finished the studies in 1995, so it's kind of creeping up to 25 years since I last gave my dose of anything to anyone.
Yeah, that's quite some time. I was just considering. I whenever I do something, I'm like, I'm not the only one that emailed Dr. Strassman about doing this. So I'm sure you've gotten thousands of emails. It's funny because what I liked about it is it was. I know they say set and setting is really important, but I also know if you're sort of worried. Because I know some people feel like maybe they've died and stuff like that. If you're in sort of a clinical setting, just like in your book, a few people mentioned they opened their eyes, saw that you were kind of calmly watching and observing them, and everything looked all right on your face. So it reassured them that they weren't dying and that everything would be okay, and then they were able to probably have a better experience. And just hearing that you had like a crash cart standing by and things like that, if something were to go wrong, I thought would help someone that was sort of nervous about trying something like that out, just to be in that setting. Although it doesn't sound very nice to be in a hospital room.
Well, it's kind of interesting about the setting anyway. Yeah, it was a small, cramped hospital room on a research unit. So you would imagine it's the worst possible place to take drugs, but I think in the case of DMT, it was the best possible place because people felt reassured. And once we started putting the once we started once we started using the eye shades, and there wasn't the kind of sterile clinical visual input coming in, it was pretty easy. I could keep my expression pretty calm, but a good thing that the volunteers couldn't, feel my sweaty, cold palms.
That's funny. Yeah, because I can imagine that you were nervous going into this because actually you went into it just really trying to observe more of the biological aspects of it, and so you were like monitoring heart rate. And I found it interesting in the book that you said that by the time you would check their blood pressure at about, I think you said 4 minutes in or whatever, they had no idea, they weren't disturbed by it or anything, right? It's like they weren't even in their body to be disturbed. They're somewhere else, right?
Yeah, the first check of their blood pressure occurred at 2 minutes after the injection was done. Yeah, and with a high dose, they didn't even feel the cuff inflate, which is it was an automatic cuff, so it really blows up
Right.
pretty strong, and people couldn't really feel it.
One of the things that I wanted to ask you after reading the book, do you think, did you have any of the participants that felt like it was all in their mind at all? I mean, did everyone feel like it was sort of this external experience, or was anybody like, I feel like my mind just created it all?
Yeah, I would say a small number. Let's see, we gave almost. I'm trying to think. Well, yeah, it was interesting. There was one guy who had no response at all. We gave him the high dose, and we completed the injection, and he lifted up the eye shades and he said, "Well, have you given me the drug yet?" And so he had zero effect. And
Wow.
with respect to the emails that I get, every once in a while I will hear about somebody that has absolutely no response to DMT. And there's a group at Imperial College in London doing a DMT study right now, and their principal in um, and their principal investigator emailed me a few weeks ago and described a guy that had zero response to DMT. So kind of on the spectrum, between zero response and the whole 9 yards. There's a small number of people who don't have too much of a response. They'll be able to open their eyes, they'll be able to move around a little bit, uh, start to talk sooner than the usual 15 to 20 minute point. And they experience it more as like an amplified kind of dream, rather than entering into a completely freestanding alien universe.
Wow, that is so interesting because as powerful as it feels, it's hard to imagine anybody could not feel anything. Do you think it's like maybe their body's already putting it out and maybe they're used to it, or they just have some kind of immunity to the chemical?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Going into my study, I was thinking that enlightenment experiences result from the natural release of DMT, and people with an enlightenment experience under their belt, might be tolerant, to being given DMT from the outside. But there were a couple of findings that refuted that idea. One was that the guy that I just described who had zero response to DMT was just a completely normal everyday Joe. He was a bartender. He liked to swim. He was a college student. He just really didn't stand out as anyone unusual. He had never meditated a day in his life.
Wow.
Um, so the other, so also, there was one, person in our study that used to be a monk, a Zen monk. And, in the course of his training, this individual had a, certified enlightenment experience. So I was expecting, that he would have, no response, to DMT. And even though, his response was, was, kind of at, the low end, it was still pretty strong. Um, so that, was one aspect of the, theory that didn't quite hold up under, the data. The other was the whole question of, DMT tolerance. In, in other words, if you are exposed to a high level of DMT, will you respond, less to being, given it again? So we did a tolerance study to address, that exact question.
Hmm.
And it, turns out there is no tolerance to DMT. If you give it, repeatedly over the course of a morning, the the response, to the last, dose, we gave it 4 times, was as, powerful as the response, to the first dose. So that was another, piece of data which didn't quite support the idea that the enlightenment experience makes you less responsive, to DMT, or you could become, tolerant to your own DMT.
I was recently watching another channel, Left of L, and they said that they didn't think anyone could reach the level that you reach in a DMT state through meditation. And I didn't know, but I know for me, I've never reached any kind of state like that. But I'm interested to know if you actually had any experiences with people that said that, hey, I've been there already through just meditation or some natural means, something as intense as what they experienced on the DMT. Did anybody report anything like that?
No, no, not in my study. But I do get the occasional email from, I suppose from, two different groups of people. One, group describe, their own naturally occurring spiritual experiences, and they say it's, just like your DMT volunteers, but they've, never done DMT.
Uh,
So, they, might be just, making it up. The comparison anyway. That is, that is, just like your volunteers. The other group of people, though, that I, hear from are, those who have done, DMT, and also, have experienced extreme altered states occurring, naturally, like a, car accident, a, near death experience, hypnagogic hallucinations, as you're either, drifting off into sleep, or you're, waking up from sleep. That kind of twilight state can be quite, psychedelic. So there are, people, that have done DMT and can make a, firsthand comparison. Um, but in my study, no. One of the volunteers, after coming out of the DMT trance, kind of looked up and said, well, can't you get there on your own with, meditation? And I said, well, good luck. Let me know. So I was, kind of offhandedly, glib about it, but, that may have not been, necessarily, called for. You look at, some of the descriptions of, some of the more, complex meditations out there, especially within the Tibetan, uh, uh, lineages, and some of them are quite, psychedelic. The visualizations, that they do are quite complex and, real and involved.
and you think with those, it is probably some sort of endogenous release of the chemical, or they've somehow figured out how to release the DMT naturally when it's something like that?
It could be, but we still don't really, have the DMT data to, verify that. Concentrations of naturally occurring DMT are really low, so it may turn out to be the case that we'll need to look at the, genetic, machinery responsible for DMT synthesis. Like, is the DMT gene turned on, during these, non-drug states like meditation or dreams or whatnot, rather than, looking for concentrations of the, substance in the in the bloodstream itself.
Now, you mentioned in the book that you've considered outside sources for, causing this release of this endogenous DMT, like, I think you mentioned like just cosmic rays or solar flares, or I can't remember the list of things right offhand, but you just mentioned outside environmental forces. And one of the things we talk on here in this channel about is sort of going into this new era of enlightenment or higher human consciousness. Do you think there could be some kind of cosmic or solar or some type of event that, all of a sudden everybody gets this moment of enlightenment, or, a DMT release on a mass scale? Do you think that's even possible?
Oh, well, you're referring to my biological explanation of the rapture. Uh,
Ah,
that that the DMT synthesizing apparatuses turned on all around the globe at the same time in every in every individual organism which possesses that gene. Um, that's speculation built on uh, even more speculation. It is possible. I mean, uh, if people have DMT like experiences without taking DMT, then it makes sense that there is some trigger, some biological trigger. Um, yeah, so that could be any that could be that could be any number of things. It could be an indwelling clock, which is ticking in every organism, which the alarm goes off at some prearranged time, and voila. Or it could be some external stimulus. The pineal gland makes DMT, and the pineal gland is responsive to electromagnetic fields. So there's some link there that someone may want to explore.
oh, okay. So maybe there's the possibility of I forget the doctor who came up with the God helmet, but it used these magnets that would sort of give people this God experience. And so there
Yeah,
could be some,
Persinger.
yeah, yeah, Persinger, that's right. So there might be sometime in the future where, people can go to this, I don't know, virtual reality looking thing, put it on their head, and it just naturally activates the DMT, and they can have an experience without actually, just more of an endogenous experience, uh, or something like that. I mean, that's within the realms of possibility, huh?
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons that people aren't looking at DMT as as much as the other drugs is because of its being endogenous. It just opens up too many cans of worms.
Mm.
Um, the brain seems to extract DMT from the bloodstream, which it only does for necessary um, components, necessary nutrients. So if you start thinking about the brain needing DMT for normal function, that's a strange and disturbing idea. Um, also the retina seems to possess an active DMT synthesizing machinery as well. So when you start to think about the retina is making DMT, and our visual appreciation of the world is mediated by a psychedelic drug, you start to kind of wonder, well, what's real, what's not real, like, is this just one big consensual DMT hallucination or not? So I think it's much easier to give psilocybin for depression or for OCD or to improve your meditation, as opposed to kind of deconstructing our epistemological foundations.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that you talking about the retina also brings back into mind that they say our third eye, or our pineal gland, has a lot of the components that our eye has in it, as far as it's maybe connected to the same place. I can't remember all the parts of it, but that's interesting that it is like our third eye, and then our eyes produce it. So it's I don't know, it was just an interesting connection there that you just kind of made for me with the eye and the retinas and everything.
Hmm. Well, the pineal gland is, it's third eye in lower animals, reptiles and whatnot. Yeah, and it has a cornea and a lens and a retina. In the case of mammals, though, it's deep in the brain, as opposed to on the surface of the skull, which is the case with lower vertebrates. Yeah, and there aren't any rods, cones, retina, lens, cornea, that kind of thing in the mammalian pineal, but still it's responsive to light, albeit not directly anymore, like it is the case with lower animals, but still it is quite intimately tied up with the visuals, perception, um, the perception of light and of darkness.
Now, in your newest book, I got to tell you, it was really cool. Not only the connection with the comparisons between the DMT state and the prophetic state, but also just the way you broke down, just the way you objectively analyzed the prophecy itself, and you sort of put them in these categories. And you actually said you relied on a lot of, like I think you said, a Zen Buddhist prayer that you would do that's help you sort of categorize the different ways you wanted to compare both states, the DMT state with the prophetic state. And I just found that interesting because it seemed like, it was just so convoluted. Just you really broke it down and made it simple. But at the same time, I was like, oh my gosh, what did he have to do to break down these and these categories and to really consider everything? And I'm sure you had to read over everything dozens and dozens of times to consider each of those categories. So a lot of research went into it, but it was fascinating that you could take us along on this journey in the comparison of the two states.
Yeah, the prophetic states book took me 16 years to write. So yeah, I really kind of yeah, I really bore down on that material. Yeah, well, I completed the DMT study in 1995. Wrote the DMT book 1998, 1999. It came out in early 2000. Um, and in the DMT study, I categorized the phenomenology of the DMT state, and you referred to Zen or Buddhism in my categorizing strategy. There's a school of psychology that developed within Buddhism called the Abhidharma, and they break mental experience down into five categories: the skandhas, the heaps, the baskets, um, and those are kind of like mental status exam categories that you learn as a medical student and you master as a psychiatrist. Perception, emotions, bodily sensation and integrity, thinking, willpower, volition, habitual, tendencies. So I use, those in the, categorizing of, the DMT state. And, that was, the basis of developing the questionnaire that we developed, to quantify the DMT effect. So when I completed my study, I wasn't quite convinced that the Buddhist, model of enlightenment was all that relevant, to the DMT experience because of differences in both the phenomenology and in the interpretation of the state, the enlightened state versus the DMT state. The enlightened state is empty of contents, um, and the DMT state is full of content. Um, so the DMT state also feels more real than real as compared to the Buddhist interpretation of the visionary experience itself, the content as you're on your way to the empty state. Buddhism, generally, at least, Zen Buddhism, which was the school I was trained in, they disregard those, phenomena, to a large extent. They're, flotsam and, jetsam on your way to the pure white light. So our volunteers, like there was one individual in the whole group that had the white light experience, and it wasn't even pure white. It was kind of yellowish white. So it wasn't anywhere near as frequent as both I anticipated and the volunteers anticipated. So I needed to look for a spiritual kind of model which both valued the content and was contentful. So I went around about and ended up returning to my own roots, which is Judaism, and started to read the Hebrew Bible. And as time went on, I began to appreciate a prophetic experience as articulated in the text. And it should probably I should probably comment on how I define the prophetic experience. Most people, when they think about prophecy, think about foretelling the future or predicting. But that isn't that isn't a necessary or crucial criterion in defining prophetic experience. For my purposes, which was more along the lines of any spiritual experience described in the text under experienced by anyone in the text. It wouldn't necessarily be one of the canonical prophets like Ezekiel or Jeremiah. It could be a foot soldier or a handmaiden or just anybody. They had visions or voices, inspiration, out of body experiences, an unusual dream which contains some truth. So if you expand the definition of the prophetic experience, the whole text basically is laden with prophetic experience. The Psalms are mostly prophetically inspired. Inspiration can be a lower level of prophecy as opposed to speaking to God voice to voice or face to face like Moses did. So when you expand the definition of the prophetic experience, you can really incorporate a lot more of the text into your investigation. So using that enlarged definition, I started to bin the prophetic experiences in the same categories which I had used in articulating the DMT effect. Like perceptual effects, physical effects, emotional effects, thinking effects, responses regarding voluntariness or willfulness or being able to interact with yourself or the experience. So that is the first part, or it's a large first part of the comparisons I make in the Prophetic States book that came out in 2014. DMT and the Soul of Prophecy. But after completing that level of comparison, I still wasn't quite satisfied with what I was comparing. It's still even though there is a huge overlap in the phenomenology of the DMT effect and the full-on prophetic experience, all you have to do is open chapter 1 of Ezekiel, and it's completely DMT-like. The vision begins with a rush with, the roar of water. He falls down, the heavens open, there's wheels, there's lightning, there's thunder. There's an angel who pulls him by the hair and, drags him through space. So it's pretty DMT like. But at the same time, you look at my book, you look at the reports of the DMT, volunteers, and they pale in comparison with respect to the impact and the profundity of the message which is transmitted, what people kind of leave with. So I was looking for other ways to compare them, to kind of highlight the difference, which felt intuitively quite profound, but I couldn't quite pinpoint it cognitively. So then I looked more carefully at the two states, and it struck me, first of all, that the level of interactions between the experient and what's being experienced was much more complex in the prophetic state, much more developed, much deeper, much broader, a lot more give and take, a lot more questions and answers, and being shown things, and having the visions interpreted for you by the angels or the beings.
Mm-hmm.
So I developed a category of what I called relatedness, and then started to compare the relatedness between the individual and the contents of the vision in the DMT state and the prophetic state. So that gave me foothold to start to point out the the greater depth of the prophetic experience, compared to the DMT one. And then when you start to look more carefully at the nature of the relationship, what is the function of the interactions, then things really becomes a lot more stark, because mostly in the DMT and the prophetic state, the purpose of the relationship is to communicate, to transmit information, and you look at the quality of the information being transmitted in the DMT state, and it really pales in comparison to the meaning and the message of what information is being transmitted in the prophetic one.
Yeah, I totally agree, and you really made that point really clear in there, because it was like with prophecy, it was a lot more actionable intelligence they were getting, opposed to in the DMT state. It was this great experience, but they didn't take away a lot from it compared to, when you compared it to the prophetic state. It seemed to be a lot more information and broader in scope as well, and better articulated, as you say, too. So there was that stark difference in it. But do you think that has to do with what you sort of bring up in the book, of this sort of top-down or bottom-up view, or whether it's neurology or neurotheology, where we're looking at the brain to God or God to the brain? Do you think that could play a big factor in this whole idea of the intelligence being, something that you take away from it that's a little bit more, articulated, as you say?
Um, yeah, it's a very complicated issue, because if you look at the current studies, using psilocybin, uh, especially the ones which are modeled after the Hopkins technique, uh, people have mystical experiences which contain certain types of information, um, unity, bliss. There is no death. Everything's fine. Um, there is an afterlife. Uh, all those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, the volunteers who participate in those kinds of studies are coached to have those kinds of experiences. They're indoctrinated, as it were. they're introduced, to a specific doctrine, like, this is, how the world works. This is the nature of religious experience. This is what's going to happen on the drug if all goes well. And, this is, the way to interact with the contents of the experience once you're in the state. And, this is, the way that you integrate it later when you're down the next months of your life, the next few years. So, people talk about these drugs, they describe them as, mystico-mimetic or theogenic. They, generate the God within. But I don't think that's the case. I think these drugs only make more real and more certain things that you're already more or less aware of, and that you hope to be true, and that you wish were true, and that you're wondering might be true. For example, Charles Manson gave people LSD, and the subjects in his study, as it were misfits. They were violent sociopaths who had an axe to grind with the larger society out there, and it was kind of ill-formed. I mean, they were kind of stragglers, more or less. And they found Manson. Manson gave them LSD, and he spun this web of helter skelter. That there was going to be a race war. The blacks were going to win. After the blacks won, Manson and his group would rule over the blacks. So in order to precipitate the race war, Manson convinced these people that helter skelter was really the case, and they were part of it, and it was their goal in life, their role in life, to expedite the the cataclysm. So he fed into their pre-existing beliefs, their pre-existing needs, their desires, and their wishes. And after enough LSD over enough time, they were missionaries. They had the zeal. And and in a way, it's the polar opposite, content-wise. But I think process-wise, it's the exact same thing, which occurs in these studies, which also are tapping into who the people are in the first place, and then educating them to look at the world and the drug experience in a certain integrated way. So in our study, I was very interested in whether drugs had religious effects. So, and I was only interested in the pharmacology of these drugs. Like, if I gave enough DMT to normal volunteers with an interest in spirituality, would they have a spiritual experience? We gave them no coaching other than it's very fast, very short. You may think you've died, but don't worry, nobody has, and if you get into any trouble, we'll help you out. That was it. That was our indoctrination. It was just get ready, hold on, report back to us. Mm-hmm. So the only person with a religious experience was a religious studies major in college. There was a nurse in our study that was really interested in the near-death experience, and she had studied and read all the the near-death literature, and she really wanted a near-death experience, and she had a near-death experience on a large dose of DMT. So it wasn't like it was make-believe. It was a near-death experience, as opposed to thinking it was or hoping it was. It was the full-on thing. Somebody else in our group was an urban shaman, and his goal in life, before he died, was to have a classic, shamanic, death rebirth experience. And we gave him a big dose of DMT, and he had a classic, death rebirth experience, which he said, I never thought it would occur this early in my life, but it was still an experience, that he wanted. somebody else was, kind of, nihilistic and kind of pessimistic about the world. And all that happened with him was he was just more convinced of the futility of, society, civilization, and, whatnot. So, people just became more of who they were. And it wasn't just like, oh, I'm thinking more about these things than I did before, but, they were absolutely convinced, whereas before it was just, kind of like an inclination. Um, so I think the question of what's the content of the, psychedelic experience, where does it come from, is an extremely, subtle and, complicated issue. And, nobody's really, looking at it, that carefully. I think if you look at, psychedelics anyway, as, super placebos, you might be able to start to make some, progress. And it isn't as if when you give a, psychedelic that the antidepressant effect is make believe or is not true. Clearly, people who take, psilocybin in the right, kind of environment, their, depression improves. Um, but I think, what occurs is before, the depression improves, there's the activation of the placebo response. So if yeah, if you look at the current literature, psilocybin is it speeds up your spiritual development. It's good for OCD. It's good for PTSD. It's good for depression. It's good for smoking. It's good for drinking. It's good for eating disorders. It's good for nature appreciation. You beat your wife less or your husband less. Um, so it's a panacea. So how do panaceas work? Well, they treat everything. So placebos in a way treat everything. Uh, so I think it's the first, like if you give a certain dose, like if you give a small if you give a small dose of a psychedelic, I don't think there's much going on with respect to the placebo response. You give a super high dose, I don't think that's the case either. But there's a window with moderate doses, which are the ones being used in current research. They're not super massive doses, and they're not tiny doses. I think what you're seeing is a placebo effect, which then ties into the expectations of the experiment. I mean, otherwise, how can you explain one drug being so useful for so many different conditions? I think at a certain point, people are going to start asking, what isn't psilocybin good for? As opposed to what is it good for? So when you have that kind of broad spectrum activity, you have to look a little deeper, I think, than how people are approaching the phenomena at this point.
Well, with psilocybin, that is probably, or magic mushrooms, for those who don't know, that seems to be what you see in, the ancients using more than any other psychedelic. I don't really know how far back, the South American, the shamanism and all that goes back, if that's just as far back. But I know with a lot of the Egyptian artwork and things like that, you'll see these mushrooms and you realize that, hey, or pine cones sort of representing the pineal gland. But it's like, this isn't really new, is it? It's like been around forever.
No, it's been around forever. Thousands of years, if not tens of thousands of years. Well, so you asked about, theoneurology versus, neurotheology. Is it your brain, generating the, feeling of communication with God? Or is it, top down that, God's using the, the brain to, communicate with us? And, where does, the information, come from? Is it, within us, or is it, is it, is it trans or is it transmitted down to us or into us somehow?
Hmm.
Uh, and I just don't think we can tell. I think it's going to end up, being a spectrum of effects, as it were. To the extent that you've got your own material, taken care of, that you're, not looking at a mirror as much as, looking through a window. Uh, if you've got your own, personality in good order, if you live a, virtuous life, if you think good thoughts, if you've got good motivations, if you can step out of the way of what's going on around you, to the extent possible, I think, the content, wherever it, comes from, I would guess would be, more altruistic, more compassionate, more just, as compared to it just, being like your own personality on steroids, as it were. Where it's, your own stuff, as opposed to, outside derived or, generated, content. But I think, as long as we're alive, we have bodies, we have brains. Who we are is going to determine what the effects are. Obviously, in the, prophetic times, God, theoretically, chose the right people at the right time, at the right place to transmit His message. Which was, repent, and things will go well, and continue to, sin, and things won't. Um, yeah, so the whole, question of the end of, prophecy is an interesting one, which was, it was declared by the rabbis, around the turn of the century. Well, at around, the time of, the turning of the Common Era, 2,000 years ago. So there's no good biological explanation, for that taking place. If indeed, some of the qualities that the prophetic state are, mediated biologically through DMT. I think it was, more an expedient, because of, the political, situation, the religious, situation, the rise of Christianity. Um, so I think, I think are still in place, but the vessels just may not be what they used to be.
That's interesting because when you brought that out in the book, I thought that was super cool just to consider. Did something happen at some point and we lost this ability to sort of hear from God? And then you brought up another prophecy that sort of led to the question I asked earlier about sort of this rapture you referred to as like a rapture type event where everybody sort of gets turned on or whatever through the endogenous DMT. But one of the prophecies you pointed out, I think it was in Joel, where it said, your young men will dream dreams, and or I can't remember the exact thing, but it sounded like everyone at some point might start to prophesy or whatever, and so that's sort of what led. So I should have brought that prophecy up because you brought it up in your book, and I thought, man, it sounds like if it did end at some point, and just these few select people were able to hear from God, it sounds like at some point things are going to turn around. And we're going to have the opposite effect, but on mass.
Yeah, there is a, yeah, I'm not sure, which of the, prophets it occurs in, but there's one uh, individual who, prophesies about how, no one will speak the name of God anymore, because it will, just be assumed. It'll, just be the, the default, mode will be an awareness of one's immediate relationship with God, as opposed to, um, needing to pray, or, needing to, fast or sleep deprive yourself, or, uh, you know, or, kind of wait, expectantly, for the return of, the prophetic experience. Um, yeah. So, yeah, it's, the notion of the world to come, or the messianic era, the day of the Lord, variously described. So, yeah, like I'm interested in, chemistry, biology, how the brain works, so I was always, looking for, what are the biological correlates, and how can you explain this, through chemistry. It is satisfying, to me at some level.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on here. Before I let you go, I wanted to ask if I know a lot of people mention DMT is sort of on their bucket list, or ayahuasca or whatever. Now, you mentioned one study that they're doing right now in London. This is a global audience, so if you're in London, you might want to check into that. I don't know if they got all the volunteers they need, but there was a post going around on Facebook that was talking about the dangers of, sort of just going to South America and just picking any old shaman, and because just like anything, there's a lot of corruption and things like that. And I want people to sort of be aware of the dangers of sort of just expecting everybody's going to be awake. I know I talked to someone recently that they said it felt like they were having the ceremony with a bunch of adolescents, and they felt like they had to be the adult there while they're on their ayahuasca journey, and it wasn't a good experience. So I know you mentioned there's some churches that do it, and then a shaman you might recommend in South America.
Yeah, there's a couple of churches that came to the U.S. and the West,
Mm-hmm.
basically, from Brazil, and they have federal protection to use ayahuasca. One's the UDV, and one is the Santo Daime. They're not everyone's cup of tea. They're quite Christianized, and you know they're a trip in and of themselves. So uh, you have to be able to suspend your judgmentalism, as it were, if you're going to enter into any of those ceremonies. And it's hard to track them down. They screen you carefully. You have to be referred by somebody else, generally. And there are, as you mentioned, innumerable shamans and shamanic retreats in Latin America. The only one I really recommend, because I know the guy that runs the center firsthand, is called Ayahuasca in Brazil, and it's run by an anthropologist named Luis Eduardo Luna. And he's a great guy. He's been doing these retreats for a long time. They're comfortable. They're in a lodge. They're gringo friendly. He gets speakers to come down from all around the world and give lectures in between ceremonies. So it's a top notch place, and I can recommend that without any reservations. Otherwise, if you're going to be drinking ayahuasca, otherwise, it's kind of it's kind of a gray zone legally, but it isn't really that gray. It's mostly against the law, because ayahuasca contains DMT and DMT Schedule 1.
Oh wow! So yeah, you can get in big trouble. That would kind of suck to be on an ayahuasca trip and get raided or something. That would make for a very good trip.
Well, you know what they're doing now. I heard about a case recently where they're doing carrier weight for DMT and ayahuasca now. It was what they would do in cases of blood or acid. They would add up the weight of the paper, and if you had like a few ounces of paper where you've had a few drops of LSD, they'd say, oh, you've got ounces of LSD, but you don't. You just have a few milligrams of LSD, but they do the carrier weight. So recently I heard about a case where they are accusing some guy of having like a quart of DMT, which is a lot of DMT if it's by volume.
Right.
But it was a quart of ayahuasca, which might contain a few hundred milligrams of DMT at most. Yeah, so they were they were really throwing the book at the guy.
Yeah, that kind of sucks. Do you see any change in the near future with respect to laws? Is anybody really pushing to sort of open this up to? Because when I watch documentaries about it, it's like every average everyday people. These aren't drug users even. These are people wanting a consciousness experience, and I don't know. It just seems like it's a lot of restrictions for to suppress it.
Well, one of the goals of the mainstreaming of psilocybin, look at Michael Pollan's new book, "Changing Your Mind" or something. Uh, it's it's a or well, it's a called to legalize, and not like uh, completely legalize, but to lower the schedule, such that anybody could prescribe it. Schedule 3, Schedule 4, um, you know, so uh, that move, that movement is afoot to make psilocybin less uh, restricted in its being able to be prescribed. The problem with lowering the schedule, even to Schedule 2, which where is cocaine resides, is that anybody with a DEA Schedule 2 license could prescribe a Schedule 2 drug. So that could include veterinarians or dentists, orthopedic surgeons. All of them can prescribe Schedule 2 drugs. Schedule 3 drugs are things like codeine, the minor narcotics, and Schedule 4 drugs are things like Valium, the benzodiazepines. So to equate psilocybin with Valium, seems a bit cavalier to me.
Yeah.
I think what is more prudent would be a little slower, process, which would perhaps create a new schedule between 1 and 2, where you would still have the security requirements of Schedule 1, but you could use the drugs for conditions that don't have a steel clad case supporting their efficacy. Like for example, you wouldn't require a huge number of studies to demonstrate that psilocybin is useful for end of life anguish. You could just have a handful of studies done at good research centers pointing toward that, and you say, okay, there is some evidence it's useful, so you can prescribe it without the same requires for a prescribable drug. um so that could be like a 1A category, something like that. I think that would forestall disasters. It might slow down the entrance of these drugs into the everyday pharmacopoeia, but I just don't think we're quite ready to introduce these drugs into the everyday pharmacopoeia quite yet.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's an interesting topic, and I guess once that happens with psilocybin, it opened the door to DMT and other psychedelics as being more readily available, at least for research and things like that, because it's difficult to even touch the stuff research-wise. I mean, now you have to jump through hoops. I know you did back in the 90s when you did your thing. You didn't even know if you were going to be able to get approved for it, right?
Well, that's an interesting, like from my DMT study, yeah, it required 2 years of just back-breaking regulatory judo.
Yeah.
But after that, I applied for and received an import license to do a psilocybin study. We got our drug from from the Swiss, and the psilocybin project. The permit process took maybe 3 to 6 months, as opposed to 2 years. And then we applied for an LSD study, and I got approval 2 months maybe. So the main stumbling block for getting our drug study off the ground was the interface between FDA and the DEA. So I mean, our work established the ground rules for a new system between those two agencies to expedite the approval of human studies with Schedule 1 drugs. So once our study got off the ground, I published that process. That was the first paper that came out of our work. It's the It's a paper I like to call the what if I'm hit by a bus paper, before we got to publish any real data. I wanted to spell out the process. If nothing else, I wanted to leave a legacy for other people to be able to study these drugs in humans. So that was the system that the group in Arizona then employed to do their psilocybin study of OCD. It was the same system that the group in Miami used to study or to do their ibogaine research. It was the same system that the UCLA group used to study MDMA. Just the same system that the Hopkins group in NYU is using to study psilocybin. So it isn't that hard anymore. If you're a good researcher, you've got a track record, you're level-headed, you sound like you know what you're doing, and hopefully you do. Yeah, I mean, you can do small studies, pilot studies, larger studies. Yeah, it isn't anywhere near as difficult as it was when I was kind of establishing that that model for the two federal agencies to work together.
That's awesome. Well, thanks for pioneering that and paving the way, because I know how difficult that is, and I'm glad to see this moving forward. I do appreciate you for coming on, taking the time, Dr. Strassman, and all the work and research you've done. It's just a wealth of information, very thought-provoking book, and I hope to talk to you soon.
Okay, well, great, Shane. Thanks. Yeah,
Right.
so if your listeners or your viewers want to get in, contact with me, they can, take a look at, my webpage, rickstrassman.com, and I have a, presence on Facebook too.
Awesome. Yeah, I do have your link on the screen as well as down in the description to make it easy for people to find you. And you can actually pick up his book from his website as well. So let's see here. So yeah, I do appreciate it. Sit tight for a second. I'm going to close this out, and then I'll be right back with you. Thanks for everybody for joining. We'll see you on the next one. Have a good one. If you'd like to support the work I do, go to paypal.me/UOTF. Thanks.